We're in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest on to the interview series, Nell Haslett-Brousse. She is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Point B. Nell, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I also use she, her pronouns. And when I was younger, I would have answered that question that I wanted to be an actress.
I love that. I always think it's interesting to think about where we thought we'd be 10, 20 years down the line. Fast forward to today as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I want to ask, it's in the title of our interview series around company culture. When you think about keeping a pulse on how people are experiencing the culture, how are you thinking about measuring this from a qualitative or quantitative way?
Yeah, I think about measuring company culture both at the macro and micro levels. And so from the macro level, the health of your culture can be measured the same way you measure an investment portfolio. So stay with me. I think about it as like, do you have diverse programs that are delivering value in different ways that are both measurable in the short term and the long term? And so for company's culture, that means you should have programs where many different types of people are both participating and benefiting. And when you think about what that programming is, it could include mentorship or sponsorship, employee resource groups, communities for people of different tenures, in-person social events, internal collaboration platforms. Those are all examples. And then once you have those programs, do you know who's participating and who's getting value out of them? How many leaders are participating in the mentorship programs? How many diverse employees? How many people are creating and viewing content on the platform? And then I also think that from a macro level, you can measure how healthy your company culture is by the volume and the quality of services back to the company. Service back to the company is something that I'm doing for the company. So like, are you struggling to find interviewers, or do you get feedback from interviewees that the people interviewing them were low energy? Do you have people volunteering to help onboard new hires, create thought leadership, create content for the internal collaboration platform, excuse me. Because I believe that intrinsic motivation to do the things that make the macro company culture healthy is a really good indicator of how much you're going to be able to sustain that. And then from the micro level, we all want to measure the health or the experience of the employee. And that shows up in employee sentiment, which we generally measure through surveys, but not just how much they like working for the company, but whether they feel they're treated fairly, whether they see leadership opportunities for themselves, or whether they feel they can bring up negative feedback without fear of retribution. And that's the kind of feedback that you can validate in 360 performance reviews and stay interviews and exit interviews. And you can also validate that sentiment through other quantitative things, like if you do a retrospective of promotion data, what are the time to promotions? Where are the promotions happening? If you have pockets in your organization without promotions, that's probably going to correlate back to negative employee sentiment. And then one kind of anecdotal way that I like to measure how engaged an employee is to ask them if they can name their company's values, because that kind of tells you how good you are at anchoring to them and how much they show up in the employee psyche.
I think those are all good questions to ask. There's not one data point or one story you can tell here as well. You have to think about it as you were talking about from micro and macro level. Always love a good analogy too in terms of thinking about it like an investment portfolio as well. And these things change over time. You're consistently asking these questions, especially over the last few years as well. How have you seen Point B's company culture really scale, grow, and change, especially as new team members join, as folks move around across the organization too?
I think there are three areas where we've seen change and really positive growth. And then there's one area where we're still trying to figure out where there's there's been a lot of change. First, I think about our employee resource groups. Like we call them our business resource groups or BRGs, but they've just flourished. And I think we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. But I really see that they've hit their groove in terms of providing community and education and culture and bringing an advisory lens. And they're constantly figuring out how to scale too, keep up with our growth. But the state of our BRGs is really strong. And a quarter of our workforce is engaged with at least one BRG. We've had over 20 events so far this year, with an average of 6% of our workforce attending each event. And that's an incredible progression from 3 or 4 years ago. And second, I've seen our cultural pillars become much more coordinated. What I mean by that is all the things that we think of when we think of culture, like employee engagement, community impact, DEI, learning and development, purpose and values work, all of that has come together and is really moving in the same direction versus being standalone. And that's been through a lot of intentional work with our people and operations teams. And then the final thing that I think that we really, I've seen totally flourish has just because the fact that we're more equipped with data to tell the story of our culture, which also then means we're able to make better decisions for our people and respond to the things that are important to them. One area we're still really figuring out, because it's changing and evolving right now, is how we continue to show up for each other without feeling like politics is a barrier for anyone. And our values and how they show up shouldn't feel like it excludes anyone. They should transcend that. So we're still calibrating the right ways of communicating and engaging our people so that our culture feels transcendent.
Yeah, showing up for each other is so important. And then how do we tangibly do that too is different for every person and different point in time as well. And you mentioned kind of that coordination and alignment and the importance of company values, taking it deeper too in terms of North Stars for the organization and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can you tell me about Point B's kind of key pillars around DEI as well and goals there?
Yeah. So I would say we have a North Star, and this might sound obvious, but it takes so much work of people coming together and kind of negotiating what is it that we're trying to do. So our North Star is that we believe we can cultivate belonging and empower our people, our customers, and our communities to thrive through diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so to meet that opportunity, we have identified 4 change levers that we can pull as a for-profit company. And I'll briefly kind of just detail them. The first is driving equity through incentives and compensation structures. The second is building a workforce that empowers diversity to heal and thrive. The third is to commit to our DEI values in who we serve and the work we do. And the fourth is uncovering and acknowledging our blind spots.
I like that you called them kind of those levers that you can actually like action upon and change as well, and moving towards that kind of one goal of creating more equity, cultivating belonging, and empowering folks as well. I know we had previously talked about kind of a scorecard too to measure how you're doing, and I can't believe we're almost at the end of 2022 as well. But what is kind of that first diversity, equity, inclusion scorecard that you and the team created back in 2020, and what are some of those goals you set through the end of the year?
Yeah, Lisa, I can't believe it's almost the end of 2022, so it's the end of our goal cycle. Our first DEI scorecard centered around 5 overarching goals. And then we had indicators within each one of those goals. So the 5 goals were that we represent the places we work, that our leadership represents the diversity of our people, that everyone's paid fairly for the work that we do, that we support the communities where we work, and that we become leaders in DEI. So like I said, we have a lot of different measures and quantitative goals tied to each of those. And where we saw the most success or achievement was with our representation goals. For example, we wanted to increase the number of Black and Hispanic or Latino identifying associates by 20% in those 2 years, and we've seen an actual increase of 83%. as a P3. So that's a pretty common story across all of our representation goals, is that we've not only met them, we've exceeded them. We also wanted to maintain one wage equity between men and women. And we have achieved that, or we've seen that for the past 4 consecutive quarters. So this is something we measure all the time. And if we see it change in the future, that's obviously something we'll address, but we're proud that we've seen that for the past 4 consecutive quarters. Where we haven't made as much progress as we want is toward equal representation for women in leadership. Right now, about 35% of our leaders are women, and that's still excellent for industry norm, but it's one we think we can impact through empowering our women's business resource groups, mentorship, training, and hopefully some more sponsorship programs.
Yeah, I think it's just as important to kind of show where you exceeded goals, which is really great, and share kind of continued progress too, because we know that it is a journey and we're not fans of box checking here as well. So it's important to celebrate and continue on. Too, you mentioned leadership, which I think is a really important piece of this puzzle as well, in terms of who is kind of leading by example and really promoting these goals, values, these pillars. How are you kind of holding these leaders, whether it's individual people managers and executives, really accountable to have an equity-driven mindset in their day-to-day processes as well?
The biggest shift that I've seen has been since our introduction of DEI core skills. So we have 3 DEI skills that are now embedded in job descriptions. And we've essentially defined the behaviors we expect by each level: manager, senior leader, executive. Because once we've defined that, we've now been able to tie all of our cultural and educational opportunities to building one of those skills. And it helps our leaders and managers self-assess and grow where they see their own gaps. And then use that growth as demonstration of DEI competencies. It also helps us understand, okay, this is a common gap that we're seeing. For example, with us, a lot of people are saying, hey, I'm a people manager and I feel like I'm not still where I need to be with cultural intelligence. So that tells me what I need to make sure we're offering is a learning opportunity. So when we think about accountability right now, it's still very much a carrot, but it is foundational, we think, for creating genuine ownership of my behavior and my.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to create that framework ahead of time as well, and putting that in the job descriptions, really empowering managers to ask for practice building these skills is really important too. We've kind of shared a couple of these, but definitely want to ask for kind of another example of how you're auditing really the employee experience. And we've seen a lot of organizations and leaders do this since the pandemic started as well. Can you tell me about how you've redesigned a system to be more equitable over the past 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, so I actually have a few things I wanted to highlight. From a recruiting and hiring perspective, our talent acquisition team has done a lot to eliminate groupthink and minimize bias. So we standardize our interview questions, we leverage panels, and also encourage the collection of independent versus group feedback. So we're having many different data points that should be totally different and independent from each other. And then our talent acquisition team has also done extensive work with our veterans business resource group to map military experience to our job levels and actually translate resumes to make the connection from what they did on service to consulting relevant experiences. So that's been a big one over the past couple of years. Our people team has also standardized our career paths, which was one of the most significant lifts you can do to standardize all our job descriptions, the skill levels associated with each role, so including those DEI skills, and providing transparency and compensation and wage equity. And that has been huge for people being able to, point to me myself and say, am I being treated equitably? It's so much more clear for them now that we have those standardized career paths. We've also introduced required training for people managers in minimizing bias in performance management and development. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about more about that in a moment here. And then a big part of making more equitable spaces for us has been creating this culture of constant reflection and learning about our individual and collective blind spots, which for us is really catalyzed through our business resource groups. They brought in external speakers to help us learn, build empathy, incorporate new habits, and use the right language, which is something that we're always hearing from our people that they're anxious about. Our BRTs have also facilitated panels and communities of support where we hear storytelling, which is incredibly effective in helping people understand pain points and how our behavior can contribute to or alleviate those pain points. And we've also participated every year in the CEO Action Day of Understanding, which brings together cross sections of the firm to learn about each other's stories and gain cross-cultural skills. And ultimately, this may be a little more conceptual, but being equitable means that our DEI efforts have to equitably benefit everyone, not just those of the dominant group who are being educated or whose behavior we are trying to change. So even in how we think about DEI and the way we audit the type of training we offer or the types of cultural events that we have, that lens of equity and who's benefiting from this is taking place to create more equitable spaces.
I love that. And that phrase that you used of creating that culture of constant reflection, I think, especially with leaders, with individuals who are coming into the organization, if you've been there for 5 years as well, really having that set level of self-awareness, asking yourself questions, and having that growth mindset is really important too. Bringing it to another kind of example of folks at the organization, how are you really investing in managers, especially new managers who might be moving from that individual contributor role to this position to really develop their skills and competencies?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is that we have these amazing learning and development and executive talent teams that have worked with our DEI network to create learning paths for managers. They include modules on important topics like accommodations, harassment and discrimination, providing feedback, and the standardized model we use to provide feedback, navigating performance management, and all of that through a DEI lens. So I talked about our feedback model. That's something that we believe is really important, not only for those who are providing feedback like the manager, but for those who are receiving feedback, so that managers are better equipped to have these hard conversations with people. And the second thing that comes to mind is that with our people team doing the standardized career pathing, it obviously helps managers in that they're able to understand their own career paths, but it just makes it that much easier for them to have conversations with their reports and guide them through career development. So it's helping our managers have more equitable tools to draw from.
I think tools and just having that opportunity and accessibility to information is really important as well, especially when we're talking about effective communication, really active listening. How are you demonstrating that you're listening to folks as well? We also know that over the past few years, the role of managers has really changed too. And folks are asking a lot of questions around needing support or just asking for advice too. And nobody has all of the answers, and that's totally fine. And sometimes this leads to workplace conflict, which I don't think is a bad word as well. One study found that only 39% of folks reported being trained or coached and really how to handle an inevitable workplace conflict. How do you resource folks to really have these hard conversations, especially leaders or managers?
Well, I can talk about what we've done, and then there's also things that we're working on right now, which is exciting. And what I can say is that in our manager training, we try and bring in relevant scenarios that are based in real examples And you are never going to be able to get to every example. We have to help people approach something without knowing the exact right thing to say. So I'm never going to be able to coach somebody to be prepared for every single conversation. But what we can coach them in is how our values play out in your response. So, for example, we believe that planning your response starts from a place of how do you want your report to feel after the interaction is over. And then we talk about how to balance validation with expectation setting. So how are you affirming that person and challenging them at the same time? Talk about how to engage with curiosity and non-judgment to understand the root of the problem. That we talk about the expectations to acknowledge impact versus intent. So if you're speaking with somebody and having a hard conversation and you say the wrong thing, how do you recover from that? And how do you have that conversation? But we also just talk about sometimes giving yourself the space to learn and self-reflect. So a lot of what we talk about in having these conversations is like understanding what activates you, what activates reactions from you, when noticing when you're ready to be able to respond or when you're ready to be able to be in that space. And so that's actually what I'm working on right now, is just kind of a very simplified way of saying, these are our values. This is this is a framework for responding in that conversation. It should always start with affirming. Thank you for telling me that. I hear you. And then understanding what they're actually trying to ask with that question. Are they trying to get information? Are they trying to understand, is what I'm experiencing normal? And then once you kind of understand what they're actually asking, where do you go from there? And sometimes you have to say, I don't know, and I need some time to think about that. So they're really hard conversations, and we're trying to focus on how do I respond to it versus what do I say?
I think that's a good way of reframing this as well, too, in terms of not looking for a script to give to someone, but really questions to ask, kind of the framework to follow as well. And really empowering folks to say, you know, I don't have the answer right now, but this is how we can continue the conversation. And these are my follow-up steps. These are your follow-up steps, or what have you too. I know that there are a lot of conversations happening in the people, talent, culture, and diversity, equity, and inclusion space right now, which is really exciting. Is there something that you are most excited about right now, and why?
Yeah, it might sound boring to some people, but I am always interested in understanding how to help elevate the impact of employee resource groups. And the reason why is that these are really concentrated groups of purpose-driven, highly engaged, often high potential individuals. And so I'm thinking about how do we help them get more embedded leaders? Things like reverse mentorship, executive sponsor teaming, creation of stretch roles. How do we help them find that maximum contribution and use of skills? How are we providing them leadership development opportunities? How do we help them create impact outside of the company? You know, new ideas about helping them achieve more and measuring their impact is something that I think all companies should be thinking about.
Well, as a former employee resource group leader, I love to hear that as well. I think it is such an important part of an organization, and also just creating those meaningful moments of connection and community. Now, are there any questions that I didn't specifically ask, and things you want to share with our audience, or any kind of key takeaways you would like to underscore before we end our conversation? I'll pass the mic back to you.
Yeah, I think there are two things I would want people to remember. And the first is just a reemphasis that culture, DEI, employee engagement are portfolios, not programs. And we have to hold in balance different investments, different beneficiaries, and both long and short-term goals. And you need to be constantly creating, planting seeds, because you don't know, everything should come to fruition at different times. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing It's just that like a good investment portfolio, control is often anathema to long-term success. So I do believe obviously in intentionality and trying to help culture move in the right direction. But this is the kind of work that's best done by those with intrinsic motivation and lived experience. So giving your people trust to do what they know will resonate with people will actually allow you to achieve more. And sometimes you have to be kind of hands off and say, I'm going to let this let this investment in our people take some time, because I believe that ultimately is going to result in more value in the long term.
I love that, bringing it back to the analogy of thinking of it as an investment portfolio as well, and really being open to change too, and thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, culture as those portfolios as well. Nell, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.